July 25, 1946, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. Dawn sits low and humid over the lagoon. The sea is too calm for what is about to happen, flat water holding the reflections of steel hulls like a mirror that refuses to look away. 95 ships lie at anchor in orderly rows, a fleet arranged as if for inspection, not execution. On some decks, animals have been placed as living instruments of measurement. The air smells of salt, fuel residue, and tropical heat, and in the stillness the only rhythm is the faint slap of water against armor plate, an old sound, stubbornly familiar, on ships that were built for thunder. What follows is not simply the end of America's battleships after World War II. It is the moment the battleship's meaning fractures, split by budgets, by strategy, by the atomic age, and by the uneasy truth that victory does not preserve the weapons that achieved it. The public memory tends to keep these ships frozen in wartime, gray silhouettes under Pacific skies, their big guns angled toward distant shorelines. But after 1945, battleships did not retire in any tidy sense. They were repurposed, mothballed, revived, modernized, sacrificed to tests, stripped for scrap, and, finally, turned into museums where schoolchildren walk through the corridors of a vanished doctrine. And if there is one symbolic object that follows them through this transformation, quiet, recurring, almost mundane, it is paint. Not the heroic paint of wartime camouflage, but the peacetime paint of preservation, thick, layered, relentlessly applied. Battleships after the war became vessels of maintenance more than movement, kept alive by crews who did not fire broadsides, but fought corrosion. Paint became a kind of democratic abundance in liquid form, the ability to preserve massive machines even when they no longer made sense. Steel could be saved, steel could be stored, steel could wait. This is what really happened to America's battleships after World War II, not a single ending, but a long unspooling, an afterlife in rust, bureaucracy, nuclear fire, and memory. At war's end, the United States possessed an armada the world had never seen, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and battleships built in astonishing numbers. Victory created a problem as large as the victory itself: what to do with the fleet when the world no longer needed it, when the nation no longer wanted to pay for it. The American public had lived through rationing and casualty lists, through long anxieties that pressed into daily life. Many believed peace would arrive like a clean sunrise, demobilize, come home, begin again. But fleets are not disbanded like marching formations. A battleship is not an infantry division. It does not vanish when you stop needing it. It persists, huge, expensive, and stubbornly physical. So the battleships were gathered into reserve fleets, what the public came to call mothball fleets, quiet anchorages where warships waited under the sun, wrapped in preservation measures, their interiors dried, their systems sealed, their decks guarded against time. Entire harbors became floating archives of American industrial power. A ship could be decommissioned without being destroyed, its crew could leave while its hull remained, kept in a suspended state between relevance and scrap. That practice, this ability to store power, was itself an expression of American capacity. A dictatorship tends to demand immediate utility from its weapons. Democracies, when they can afford it, sometimes preserve options. Paint, desiccants, sealed compartments, careful inventory, these were not glamorous acts, but they were acts of abundance. They signaled that America did not have to choose between keeping everything forever and destroying everything at once. It could place steel in parentheses. And yet, even in those calm anchorages, another force was gathering, the new grammar of war. The battleship had reached its peak at the exact moment the age that required it began to disappear. German and Japanese planners had once dreamed of battleships as instruments of destiny, massive, disciplined, decisive. There was an expectation, almost a faith, that sea power would be settled by gunfire and armor, by the clean geometry of fleets exchanging salvos. Even after aircraft carriers proved the future, the myth of the battleship lingered. It was more than a weapon, it was ideology made steel, order, hierarchy, industrial will. What they experienced instead, by 1945 and after, was the humiliating truth that the battleship could be made obsolete not by another ship, but by an invisible equation: range, altitude, yield. The sky became the battlefield's high ground, and then the atom made even the sky feel too close. This is why Bikini Atoll matters. Operation Crossroads, approved at the highest levels and carried out in full public awareness, was not merely a test. It was a demonstration staged for a world in transition, a spectacle meant to answer a question that haunted planners: what does an atomic bomb do to a fleet? On July 1, 1946, and again on July 25, the United States detonated nuclear weapons over and under the waters of Bikini Atoll, using a target fleet anchored in the lagoon. The Naval History and Heritage Command records that the target fleet consisted of 95 ships, and that animals were placed aboard to study effects, life turned into data, breathing transformed into instrumentation. In the imaginations of many observers, especially those raised on the old language of armor, the expectation was that battleships would prove their toughness, that steel would endure, that the fleet would be damaged, certainly, but fundamentally survivable. After all, these were ships built to take punishment, torpedoes, shells, fire. Their armor had been engineered for violence. But what Crossroads revealed was not merely destruction. It was contamination, an invisible occupation that made survival meaningless. The first test, Able, was an airburst. The second, Baker, was underwater, and it created something the naval world had never confronted at this scale, a radioactive sea. The National World War II Museum describes Crossroads as a moment when atomic detonations tore into a fleet anchored, in the name of science, and the aftermath exposed the deadly illusion that such weapons could be treated as just another category of explosive. The test did not simply sink ships, it transformed them into problems. Some hulls remained afloat, but their surfaces were poisoned, their interiors dangerous, their future uncertain. Paint could preserve steel from saltwater. It could not preserve it from fallout. In that difference lies one of the great turning points of naval history. The battleship had been the ultimate symbol of national strength, big guns, heavy armor, a visible statement of power. But Crossroads forced a new symbolism onto these ships. They became sacrificial objects, proof that the age of visible power was ending. What mattered now could not always be seen. After Crossroads, the post-war fate of battleships divided into several paths. Each one a quiet verdict on what modern war required. Some ships were used as targets and lost, their dignity rewritten into a scientific footnote. Some were scrapped, because steel, even victorious steel, has a price. In peacetime, some were mothballed, preserved in case history demanded their return. And a few, especially the Iowa class, would come back, again and again, like ghosts repeatedly summoned because no replacement ever fully replicated what they could do, deliver overwhelming gunfire, survive punishment, and embody an older kind of intimidation. The Iowa-class battleships, USS Iowa, BB-61, USS New Jersey, BB-62, USS Missouri, BB-63, USS Wisconsin, BB-64, were the last American battleships to serve as active warships. Their post-war stories read less like retirement and more like cyclical resurrection. They were decommissioned, then recommissioned, sent back to war under new political climates, updated with missiles, then finally put away for good when cost and doctrine overcame nostalgia. USS Missouri, the ship most Americans associate with the formal Japanese surrender, was decommissioned for the final time in 1992, later becoming a museum ship. Its steel preserved not for combat, but for memory. In the most symbolic anchorage imaginable, Missouri ultimately found a public afterlife at Pearl Harbor, where visitors can walk her decks and feel the strange continuity of American war, the place of beginning and the ship of ending, tied together in one harbor. USS New Jersey, the most decorated battleship in U.S. history by many accounts, lived an even more restless afterlife. Reactivated for Vietnam, returned to reserve, then revived again during the Reagan-era push for a 600-ship navy, and sent to Lebanon, her 16-inch guns, weapons of World War II, echoing against Cold War terrain. The battleship's revival in Lebanon carried a grim irony, a weapon designed for fleet action, used instead for shore bombardment and deterrence, its shells landing inland as if the ocean itself had reached out to strike the land. This pattern, mothball, crisis, reactivation, reveals what really happened after World War II. Battleships were never simply declared obsolete in one clean moment. They were declared too expensive, too manpower heavy, too specialized, until the world produced a problem that required exactly what they offered. In Korea, the big guns mattered again. In Vietnam, they mattered again. In Lebanon, they mattered again. In the Gulf, they mattered again. And each time, their return was not just a technical decision, but a psychological one. Battleships carried a kind of certainty. They were visible. They were loud. They could be pointed at a coastline and understood instantly by anyone watching. In a world where Cold War conflict often hid behind proxies and ambiguity, battleships offered something blunt, an unmistakable signal. Yet every resurrection carried the same shadow. The battleship belonged to an older strategic imagination. Each reactivation was both proof of usefulness and evidence of failure. Failure to build something that could replace the combination of endurance, intimidation, and gunfire that these ships embodied. That is the transformation at the heart of their post-war story, from decisive capital ships to tools of contingency, from symbols of dominance to symbols of retained capability, from frontline doctrine to expensive option. And through it all, paint returns. In reserve fleets, battleships were coded and maintained, their systems preserved, their interiors stabilized. The work was not romantic, but it was revealing. A democracy with enough resources can afford to preserve yesterday's power while building tomorrow's. It can keep choices alive. It can postpone finality. But preservation also has a cost, not just money, but attention. Every ship kept alive in reserve is a reminder that history does not end neatly. The fleet remains, waiting, asking whether the future will need it. Even the nuclear tests, in their own way, were acts of theater meant to shape public perception. Operation Crossroads was not secret, it was meant to be seen, meant to be understood. The question was not only what the bomb would do to minds, especially the minds of policymakers who still spoke the language of dreadnoughts. The National World War II Museum. For German and Japanese veterans, men who have been trained in systems where the state claimed permanence, the American post-war handling of battleships might have felt alien. The United States did not preserve ships to glorify the past, but to manage uncertainty. It did not keep them as monuments to ideology, but as assets. Some were sacrificed publicly to prove a point. Others were stored quietly, a handful were modernized and used again. That flexibility, wasteful by some standards, strategic by others, is part of what defined American power after 1945. It was not only the ability to build, but the ability to keep, discard, revive, and repurpose. It was abundance expressed not as extravagance, but as option. And yet, the end still came. By the 1990s, even the Iowa class, magnificent, upgraded, bristling with modern weapons, could not escape the arithmetic of manpower and cost. They were finally decommissioned, their era closing not with a single dramatic sinking, but with paperwork, budget lines, and the slow certainty of technological change. USS Missouri's final decommissioning in 1992 is often marked as the end of the American battleship as an active instrument of war. What remains today is the museum age, battleships as public memory, floating classrooms, civic relics. Their guns are silent, but their presence is still overwhelming. Visitors walk past turrets that once hurled shells weighing more than a small car, and the scale forces a question that history always asks: what kind of world required this? In the end, what really happened to America's battleships after World War II is that they became mirrors, reflecting the changing face of power. They reflected a transition from gunfire to aircraft, from aircraft to missiles, from visible fleets to invisible deterrents. They reflected the American ability to preserve options, even at immense cost. They reflected the moral tension of the atomic age, when survival could be rendered meaningless by contamination. And they reflected a deeper truth, that freedom and abundance are not only ideals, but infrastructures, systems capable of building, maintaining, and even mothballing the tools of violence while choosing, again and again, what kind of nation they will serve. Paint, in this story, is not just paint. It is the quiet labor of preservation, the decision to keep steel intact while the world changes around it. It is the tangible sign of a society wealthy enough to maintain what it no longer immediately needs, and stable enough to treat even weapons as things that can be stored, debated, repurposed, or turned into museums rather than shrines. And so the battleship's final voyage is not across an ocean, but across time. A ship like Missouri ends not in battle, but at a pier, where families walk her decks under bright sun. The guns that once spoke in thunder now point harmlessly toward the horizon. The steel that once carried war now carries footsteps. The hull that once symbolized decisive power now holds something quieter, the memory that power is always temporary, and that what matters most is what a nation chooses to do when it no longer has to fight. That is the afterlife of America's battleships. Not a simple decline, but a long transformation, from weapons of victory into artifacts of warning. And if there is an epilogue written into their rivets and welds, it is this. The greatest strength is not merely the ability to build battleships. It is the ability to outgrow them, without forgetting what they cost, what they protected, and what they could never finally guarantee.